There is a hill in the old heart of this city, and it is not large. You could walk across it in a few minutes. It is a raised platform of ancient stone, maybe 15 hectares, crowned by a golden dome that catches the sun. From a distance it looks peaceful, beautiful even. Just an old walled enclosure on a modest hill in a modest city in a small strip of land at the eastern end of the Mediterranean. And it may be the most fought-over piece of ground on the entire planet. For roughly 3,000 years, people have killed and died for this hill. Empires have risen and fallen over it. It has been conquered and reconquered, and conquered again. By some counts, this city has been captured or besieged more than 40 times, destroyed and rebuilt over and over on the same stones. Babylonians and Romans, Persians and Arabs, Crusaders and Turks, and the armies of the modern world have all shed blood for it. And they have done it, almost all of them, for the same reason. Because for a huge share of the human race, for Jews, for Christians, for Muslims, billions of people, across thousands of years, this is not just a hill. It is the single most sacred place on the face of the earth. The place where heaven and earth are believed to touch. Think about that for a moment. 3 of the world's great religions, faiths that between them claim more than half of all the human beings alive today, all look to the same small city, and, astonishingly, in large part to the same few hundred meters of stone as the holiest ground in existence. Not 3 different holy cities, one, the same one, layered on top of each other, jostling against each other, sharing walls and gates and air, in a space so small you can see all of it from a single rooftop. So here is a city that stands for billions of people as the closest place on earth to God, a city of unbearable beauty and holiness, prayed toward, wept over, and longed for across the entire world for 3,000 years. And here, in the same breath, is one of the most bitterly contested, most divided, most sorrow-soaked cities on the planet, a place where that very holiness has produced not peace, but conflict without end. Both of those things are true at the same time. Neither one is an exaggeration, and that is the terrible, fascinating question this city forces upon us, the question at the heart of everything you are about to see. What happens when a single place is loved too much, when the most sacred site of 3 different faiths and 2 different peoples is the same small patch of ground that none of them will ever willingly give up? Can a city be so holy that its holiness becomes a wound that never heals? Come with us now to the hill at the center of the world, and we will try to understand how one small city came to hold so much of humanity's hope and so much of its heartbreak in the same handful of ancient stone. This is Jerusalem. To understand Jerusalem, you have to begin not with religion, but with a spring of water and a stubborn ridge of rock, because before it was holy, it was simply a place where people could survive. Jerusalem sits high in the Judean hills on the spine of the land, far from the sea and far from any great river. It is dry, rocky country, and by every normal rule, it is a strange place to build a great city. There is no harbor, no mighty river, no rich delta. But it had 2 things. It had a defensible position, a narrow ridge, protected on several sides by steep valleys, easy to fortify and hard to attack. And crucially, it had water, a single, reliable spring, the Gihon, bubbling up at the foot of the ridge, enough to sustain a settlement in a thirsty land. Water and a hilltop. That was the beginning. People have lived on this spot for well over 5,000 years, long before it was sacred to anyone. A small fortified town of a people called the Jebusites, clinging to their ridge above their spring. And then, around 3,000 years ago, according to the tradition that would shape everything to come, a king arrived and changed the destiny of the place forever. His name was David. He captured the small hill fort of the Jebusites and made it his capital, a shrewd political choice, a neutral spot that belonged to none of the tribes he sought to unite into a single kingdom, so could belong to all of them. He brought the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred chest that, in the tradition, held the tablets of the law given to Moses, up to the city, and made Jerusalem not just a political capital, but the spiritual center of his people. And his son, Solomon, did the thing that would echo for 3,000 years. On the rocky summit of the hill just north of the old town, on a great outcrop of bedrock, he is said to have built a temple. A single, central house for the God of Israel, magnificent in cedar and gold, to hold the ark in its innermost chamber, the Holy of Holies, a space so sacred that only the high priest could enter it, and only once a year. That hill became known as the Temple Mount, and that bedrock summit, that specific piece of stone, is where our story truly begins. Because almost everything that follows, all 3,000 years of glory and catastrophe, will circle back again and again to that one rock. Because in Jewish tradition, this was no ordinary hill. This was Mount Moriah, the very place where, in the book of Genesis, patriarch Abraham had been ready to sacrifice his son, the ultimate test of faith, before God stayed his hand. It was, some traditions held, the foundation stone of the world itself, the place from which all creation had begun, the point where the presence of God entered the world. To build the temple here was to build at the exact point where earth was closest to heaven, to put a roof over the seam where the divine touched the mortal. And so, for the first time, modest hill in the dry Judean highlands became something more than a fortress. It became, for a whole people, and eventually for much of the world, the center of the world. But holiness in Jerusalem has never brought safety. It has brought armies, and the first great catastrophe was not long in coming. For a few centuries, the Temple of Solomon stood at the heart of the kingdom of Judah, and Jerusalem grew into a true holy city, the focus of an entire people's faith and identity. And then, in 586 BC, the superpower of the age arrived at its walls. The Babylonians, under King Nebuchadnezzar, laid siege to Jerusalem, broke through, and did the unthinkable. They burned the city, tore down the temple, and carried the people of Judah off into exile in Babylon. The temple, the house of God, the center of the world, was a smoking ruin. The people were gone. It should have been the end. Small nations were destroyed like this, all the time in the ancient world, their people scattered and absorbed into greater empires, their gods forgotten, their names lost. That is what conquest usually meant. Not just the fall of a city, but the erasure of a people. But something extraordinary happened instead. In exile, by the rivers of Babylon, the exiles did not forget, and they did not dissolve. They wept for Jerusalem. They swore never to forget it. "I forget you, O Jerusalem," runs one of the most famous and haunting lines they left us. "Let my right hand forget its skill. Let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you." They turned their longing for this lost city into the very heart of their faith and their identity. And when, about 50 years later, the Persian king Cyrus conquered Babylon and allowed the exiles to return, they came home and built the temple again. The second temple, rebuilt on the same rock, in the same place, because there was only one place it could ever be. No other spot on earth would do. And here we meet, for the first time, the pattern that defines this entire city, the thing that makes Jerusalem unlike anywhere else on earth. Destroy it, and it is not forgotten. It is longed for. Exile the people, and they carry the city in their hearts across the world, and dream of return. Jerusalem's power was never really in its walls or its wealth. It was in the almost unbreakable grip it held on the human heart. A grip that would, over the centuries, be shared by more and more of the human race. Second Temple stood for centuries, and under a brilliant and brutal king named Herod the Great, in the decades before the Common Era, it was rebuilt on a colossal scale, one of the wonders of the ancient world. Herod was a master builder of monstrous ambition, and he flattened and vastly expanded the top of the Temple Mount into the enormous stone platform that still stands today, the largest such platform in the ancient world, an artificial plateau held up by massive retaining walls of limestone blocks, so precisely cut and so enormous, some weighing hundreds of tons, they still astonish engineers and archaeologists who study how they were ever moved and set in place without mortar. On that vast platform rose a temple of dazzling white marble and gold, its facade so bright in the sun that ancient writers said pilgrims had to look away. Visible from far across the Judean hills, the destination of hundreds of thousands, who streamed to it at the great festivals. It was the beating heart of the Jewish world, and it made Jerusalem one of the most magnificent pilgrimage cities of the entire Roman Empire. This was the Jerusalem into which, according to the Christian Gospels, a Jewish teacher named Jesus of Nazareth walked in the final week of his life. A city crowded with Passover pilgrims, dominated by Herod's gleaming temple, simmering with tension under Roman occupation, and with him a whole new chapter of the city's holiness was about to begin. But hold that thought, because first came the second great catastrophe, and it was even greater than the first. By the 1st century, this land was a restless province of the mighty Roman Empire, and its people chafed bitterly under Roman rule. The year 66, they rose in open revolt. Rome's response was overwhelming. After a long and horrific campaign, in the year 70, the Roman legions under the future Emperor Titus stormed Jerusalem. They breached the walls, fought through the city, and burned the temple to the ground. The second temple, like the first, on the same rock, was destroyed, and this time it would never be rebuilt. The consequences are almost impossible to overstate. The Romans crushed the revolt, and a later one after it, with terrible thoroughness. They killed or enslaved vast numbers, expelled Jews from the city, and even renamed it, trying to erase its very identity, building a Roman town on the ruins and forbidding Jews to enter. After a second great Jewish revolt was crushed, around the year 135, the Emperor Hadrian went further still. He plowed the city under, rebuilt it as a pagan Roman colony called Aelia Capitolina, erected a temple to the Roman god Jupiter on or near the ruins of the Jewish temple, and renamed the whole land in an effort to sever the Jewish connection to it forever. For a time, the very name Jerusalem was wiped from the map. It was one of the most systematic attempts in history to erase a city and a people's bond with it. The great center of Jewish worship was gone, and the Jewish people were scattered ever more widely across the world in what became known as the diaspora, a dispersion that would last, for most, nearly 2,000 years. But once again, they did not forget. With the temple gone, Judaism itself transformed, from a religion centered on sacrifice at one holy place into a religion of study, prayer, and law that could be carried anywhere, in any land, and survive. Rabbis and scholars replaced priests. The synagogue and the sacred text replaced the altar. It was one of the great acts of survival in human history, a faith that lost its single holy center and, rather than dying, reinvented itself to live everywhere at once. And yet the longing for Jerusalem never faded. For nearly 2,000 years, wherever they were in the world, in Spain or Poland, in Yemen or Morocco, or the cities of Europe, Jews would pray facing Jerusalem, end their Passover meals with the words, "Next year in Jerusalem," would break a glass at every wedding in memory of the destroyed temple, would leave a patch of wall in their homes unfinished as a sign of mourning for the city. No people has ever remembered a lost city so fiercely for so long. All that physically remained of Herod's great temple complex was a section of the western retaining wall, a wall of massive ancient stones, not of the temple itself, but of the platform it had stood on. And that surviving wall, the Western Wall, would become, over the centuries, the holiest place in the world where Jews could pray, the closest accessible point to where the Holy of Holies had once stood. For generations they came to it to mourn what was lost and pray for what might return, pressing their prayers into its cracks, until some began to call it the Wailing Wall. Hold on to that wall. It is still standing. We will return to it, because people are praying there right now, tonight, as they have for many hundreds of years. And there is a strange twist in what the Romans did next, for it shaped the city too. When the Roman Empire itself became Christian in the 4th century under Constantine, the pagan city of Aelia Capitolina became a Christian holy city almost overnight, and the Romans who had been ignored, the Temple Mount, now poured their devotion instead into the sites of Jesus' death and resurrection, leaving the temple platform deliberately in ruins, even as a place to dump refuse, as a visible sign that the old order had passed. So the very hill that was holiest to the Jews sat neglected and desolate for centuries, while a short walk away, magnificent churches rose over the Christian holy places. Contrast, the ruined mount and the glorious churches would be the state of the city when, 3 centuries later, Islam arrived and found in that neglected rock the site of its own most sacred story. Now the story branches, because while the temple burned, something else had happened in this same city that would change the world just as profoundly. In roughly the year 30, in that same Jerusalem of Herod's temple, the Christian Gospels tell us that Jesus of Nazareth, a Jewish preacher from Galilee, believed by his followers to be the promised Messiah, the Son of God, came to the city for the festival of Passover. And it was here in Jerusalem, over a handful of days, that the events at the very center of the Christian faith are said to have taken place. Here he is said to have driven the money changers from the temple shared a last supper with his followers and been betrayed and arrested in a garden on the Mount of Olives just outside the walls. Here he was condemned, forced to carry his cross through the city streets, a route Christians still walk today, called the Via Dolorosa, the Way of Sorrows. Here, on a low hill called Golgotha, just outside the city wall of the time, he was crucified. And here, in a nearby tomb cut into the rock, his followers laid his body. And here, they believe, 3 days later, he rose from the dead. For Christians, this makes Jerusalem the most sacred city on earth, the place of the crucifixion and the resurrection, the very ground where, in their belief, God died and conquered death. Every year, Christians relived those final days here in the most literal way. During Holy Week, pilgrims from every corner of the earth walk the Via Dolorosa, stopping at the 14 stations of the cross that mark the stages of Jesus' final walk. Through the crowded market lanes of the Muslim and Christian quarters, to the great church at the end. And when, 3 centuries after the crucifixion, the Roman Empire itself became Christian under the Emperor Constantine, that belief was written permanently into the stone of the city. Constantine's mother, Helena, came to Jerusalem on a pilgrimage in the 4th century, seeking out the holy places. And over the site identified as Golgotha and the nearby tomb, she had built one of the most important churches in all of Christianity, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It stands there still, in the Christian quarter of the Old City, a vast, ancient, shadowy, incense-filled labyrinth of chapels and stairways and domes, believed by a huge share of the world's Christians to enclose both the rock of the crucifixion and the empty tomb of the resurrection, the holiest site in the Christian world. There is a detail about that church that captures something profound about Jerusalem. The Holy Sepulchre is shared, uneasily, by 6 different Christian denominations: Greek Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Armenian, Coptic, Syriac, and Ethiopian, whose rights to each chapel, each pillar, even each candlestick, are governed by a centuries-old arrangement so delicate that any change can spark a dispute, sometimes even a brawl between monks. So fraught is the rivalry that, famously, the keys to the holiest church in Christianity have for centuries been held by a Muslim family, who unlock the doors each morning, precisely because the Christian communities could not agree among themselves who should hold them. A wooden ladder beneath one of the windows has remained in the same spot for over 250 years, because no one is permitted to move it without everyone's agreement, and agreement never comes. It is a small, almost comic emblem of the whole city, even within a single faith, in a single church, over a single sacred spot. The passion runs so deep that it hardens into permanent, immovable dispute. Christians cannot fully share one church. What hope is there for 3 religions to share one hill? So now, on the same small hill, there are 2 overlapping holy geographies. The Temple Mount, sacred to the Jews as the site of the temple and the presence of God, and, a few hundred meters away, the Holy Sepulchre, sacred to the Christians as the site of the death and resurrection of Christ. 2 of the world's great faiths, their holiest ground in the same walled town. And within a few centuries, a third would arrive, and its holiest site would land on the very same rock as the first. In the 7th century, a new faith swept out of Arabia with astonishing speed: Islam. and Islam from its very beginnings held Jerusalem in the deepest reverence. There are two profound reasons. First, in its earliest years, the followers of the Prophet Muhammad prayed not toward Mecca, but toward Jerusalem, the holy city of the earlier prophets, whom Islam deeply honors, including Abraham, Moses, David, Solomon, and Jesus, all of whom are revered figures in the Islamic tradition. Jerusalem was the first Qibla, the first direction of Muslim prayer. 4. A revelation later turned the direction toward Mecca. Second, and most importantly, Islamic tradition holds that it was to this city that the Prophet Muhammad was miraculously carried in a single night from Mecca, the night journey, and that from this sacred spot, from that same rock on the Temple Mount, the very stone associated with Abraham and with Solomon's temple, he ascended through the 7 heavens into the presence of God, meeting the earlier prophets along the way, before returning to Mecca before dawn. To Muslims, this makes the site the third holiest place in all of Islam, after only Mecca and Medina. They call the whole sacred platform, not the Temple Mount, but Al-Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary. Notice what has happened here, because it is the astonishing knot at the center of everything. All 3 faiths trace themselves back to the same patriarch, Abraham. They are, together, called the Abrahamic religions. All 3 revere many of the same prophets, and all 3, in their traditions, connect their holiest moments to the same rock. The rock where Abraham bound his son, the rock where Solomon built the temple, the rock from which Muhammad ascended to heaven. 3 faiths, 1 Abraham, 1 rock. They are not strangers fighting over a random hill. They are, in the deepest sense, a divided family, quarreling over the most precious thing they share. When Muslim armies took Jerusalem in the year 638, they came to a Temple Mount that the Christian Romans had left as a neglected ruin, even a rubbish dump, in deliberate contrast to their glorious churches elsewhere in the city. The Caliph Umar, according to tradition, was led to the site and had it cleared and cleaned with his own hands, reclaiming it as sacred ground. It is also said that he declined to pray inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre when invited, praying outside it instead, so that his followers would not later turn the church into a mosque on the grounds that he had prayed there, a gesture of restraint remembered ever after. And over that bare rock of the Ascension, the end of the 7th century, the Muslims raised one of the most beautiful and iconic buildings on earth. The Dome of the Rock, its golden dome and gorgeous tilework crowning the sacred platform, sheltering the very stone. Beside it, at the southern end of the platform, they built the great congregational mosque, Al-Aqsa, the farthest mosque, named for that night journey. That golden dome you saw at the very start of this film, catching the sun on the hill, that is it, the Dome of the Rock, standing on the exact spot, the exact rock where the Jewish temple once stood. And there, in that single sentence, lies the deepest knot in the entire history of Jerusalem. The holiest site in Judaism and one of the holiest sites in Islam are not near each other. They are the same place, the same rock. The Jewish temple stood where the Muslim shrines now stand. The wall where Jews pray is the outer retaining wall of the platform on which the Muslim sanctuary sits. You cannot separate them. They are layered directly on top of one another. In the same few hundred square meters, the most sacred ground on earth, for two different faiths at once, with the holiest church of a third faith a stone's throw away. There is nowhere else like it in the world. And there was never any way that such a place could be simple. For the next 1,000 years and more, Jerusalem passed from hand to hand, and each new ruler left another layer on the ancient stone. The city became, above all, a place of pilgrimage, Muslim, Christian, Jewish pilgrims, all making their way to the holy sites, sometimes in peace, sometimes not. For centuries under Muslim rule, the city was generally, though not always, a place where the three faiths could coexist, with Christians and Jews living as protected communities. But in the 11th century, fragile balance shattered in one of the most consequential and violent chapters of all, the Crusades. In the year 1099, after a long and brutal siege, armies of European Christian knights, the Crusaders, stormed Jerusalem, having marched thousands of miles across the world, with the express goal of taking the holy city for Christendom. Pope Urban II had called on the knights of Europe to reclaim Jerusalem, and tens of thousands had answered, in one of the most extraordinary and terrible mass movements of the Middle Ages. Their capture of the city was accompanied by a horrific massacre of its Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. The streets, chroniclers wrote, ran with blood, a bloodbath that would be remembered with horror and bitterness for centuries, and that still echoes in the region's memory today. The Crusaders made Jerusalem the capital of a Christian kingdom that would last in the city for most of a century. They turned the Dome of the Rock into a church, crowning it with a cross, and Al-Aqsa into a royal palace, and then the headquarters of the Knights Templar, the famous warrior monks who took their very name from the Temple Mount on which they were housed. But they could not hold it forever. In 1187, a brilliant Kurdish Muslim leader named Saladin, Salah ad-Din, united the surrounding Muslim world, defeated the Crusader army at the Battle of Hattin in the searing heat of Galilee, and then retook Jerusalem for Islam. And here history recorded a striking contrast. Where the Crusaders had taken the city in a massacre, Saladin, in victory, showed a restraint and mercy that made him legendary even among his enemies in Europe. He spared the population, allowed the Christians to ransom themselves or leave in safety, and restored the Muslim the Dome of the Rock, taking the Kront and reconsecrating the sanctuary. Saladin's chivalry became famous across the medieval world, and his reconquest returned Jerusalem to Muslim rule, where, through a succession of dynasties, and despite later Crusader attempts to regain it, it would largely remain for the next 7 centuries. The city passed to the Mamluks of Egypt, who adorned it with beautiful colleges and fountains, and then, in 1517, to the mighty Ottoman Empire, which would rule Jerusalem for 400 years. And one of the greatest Ottoman sultans, Suleiman the Magnificent, left the mark on the city that every visitor still sees today. In the 16th century, he rebuilt the great walls of the old city, nearly 5 kilometers of massive honey-colored stone ramparts, studded with gates that still enclose the ancient heart of Jerusalem. Those are the walls in every photograph, the walls that ring the domes and towers in the classic view of the city. They feel unimaginably old, and they are old, but they are Ottoman, barely 5 centuries old, wrapped around a city whose sacred story was already ancient when they were built. Suleiman also restored the dome of the rock, cladding it in the exquisite blue tiles that, along with its later gold covering, give it the dazzling beauty it has today. Layer upon layer upon layer, every ruler who ever held Jerusalem added something, and almost none of it was ever fully erased. The city is a stone archive of 3,000 years of human devotion. By the 19th century, the old city had settled into the shape it still holds. A small walled space, barely a square kilometer, divided into quarters: the Muslim quarter, the Christian quarter, the Armenian quarter, and the Jewish quarter. A dense, ancient labyrinth of stone lanes and markets and holy places, where the call to prayer, the church bells for prayers at the Western Wall, all sound within earshot of one another. A whole world of faith, packed into a space you can walk across in 15 minutes. Step back from the history for a moment and walk the old city itself, because to understand why this place grips the heart so fiercely, you have to feel what it is actually like, and it is like nowhere else on earth. Enter through one of the great gates in Suleiman's walls: the Damascus Gate, the Jaffa Gate, the Lion's Gate, and you step out of the modern world entirely. The lanes are narrow, worn smooth and slippery by millions of feet over thousands of years, often roofed over into shadowy, vaulted tunnels where shafts of light fall through gaps onto the ancient stone. They are lined with the souk, the markets, where the air is thick and layered with the smell of spices piled in cones, of roasting coffee and cardamom, of fresh bread and mint and incense, and loud with the calls of vendors, the rattle of carts, the murmur of a dozen languages. The four quarters press directly against each other, so that you can pass from one world into another in a few steps. In the Muslim quarter, the largest and most crowded, the lanes throng with life and lead toward the gates of the Haram al-Sharif. In the Christian quarter, pilgrims from every nation on earth, Filipino, Nigerian, Russian, Brazilian, Greek, move in slow processions along the Via Dolorosa toward the Holy Sepulchre, some carrying wooden crosses, and the bells of a dozen denominations ring out across the rooftops. In the Armenian quarter, the smallest and most private, an ancient Christian community that has kept its own language and liturgy here for 16 centuries, lives quietly behind old walls and gates. And in the Jewish quarter, largely rebuilt after 1967, life centers on the great open plaza before the Western Wall, and on the study, houses and synagogues, where the sound of prayer and learning never really stops. What astonishes every visitor is the sheer compression of it, the way the holiest sites of three world religions and the daily lives of the people who tend them are all packed into a walled space, smaller than many a single city park. You can stand in one spot and hear, at once, the muezzin's call to prayer from the minarets, the tolling of church bells, and, drifting up from below, the murmur of Hebrew prayer at the wall. Nowhere else on earth are the sacred centers of so much of humanity so tightly, so intimately, so impossibly interwoven, sharing the same stones, the same air, the same narrow sky. And at that wall, at any hour of the day or night, you will find people praying, men and women in separate sections, pressing close to the massive ancient stones, some rocking gently back and forth in prayer, some standing in silence with a hand and forehead against the rock, some weeping openly, many tucking small folded papers, written prayers, sent from all over the world, into the cracks between the 2,000-year-old blocks, where they accumulate by the millions before being gathered and buried with reverence. One of the most moving sights in the world, this unbroken devotion at the last remnant of the temple, a longing sustained across 2,000 years of exile and return, still burning as fiercely as ever. And directly above and behind that wall, up on the platform it holds up, is the serene, vast, open space of the Haram al-Sharif, with the golden dome of the rock at its center and the silver-grey dome of Al-Aqsa beyond, where Muslims come to pray in their thousands, especially on Fridays and during the holy month of Ramadan, when the great platform fills with the faithful. And a few minutes walk away, under its own ancient domes, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre receives its endless stream of Christian pilgrims who kneel to kiss the stone where Christ's body is said to have been laid, and line up to enter the tiny shrine built over the empty tomb. 3 faiths, 3 streams of devotion, all flowing through the same tiny walled city at the same time, every single day. It is beautiful almost beyond description, and it is a powder keg. Because all of this devotion is layered onto the same contested ground, and in our own age, that ancient tension has become the heart of one of the world's most intractable conflicts. Now we come to the modern chapter, and here, more than anywhere, this film must simply try to explain, honestly and fairly, without taking a side, because Jerusalem is at the center of a conflict in which good and decent people hold deeply, painfully opposed views, and in which 2 peoples both have profound ties to the same land. Over the past century and more, the land of which Jerusalem is the heart became the object of 2 competing national movements. On one hand, the Jewish people, after nearly 2,000 years of dispersion and persecution across the world, expelled from country after country, confined to ghettos, subjected to massacres, finally to the industrialized horror of the Holocaust, in which 6 million were murdered. In the heart of 20th century Europe, sought to return to their ancient homeland and re-establish a Jewish state, a place of refuge and self-determination, with Jerusalem, the city they had prayed toward and wept for over millennia, at its spiritual core. The longing was not new. It was 3,000 years old, carried in every prayer. On the other hand, the Palestinian Arab people who had lived in this land for many centuries, who farmed its terraces and filled its towns and cities and called it home, and for whom Jerusalem, Al-Quds the Holy, was likewise a beloved and ancient center of identity, culture, and faith, sought their own national life and self-determination in the same land, and feared being dispossessed of it. 2 peoples, 1 land, 1 city at the center of it, both with deep, genuine, ancient roots, and no way, so far, for both to have everything they hold sacred. It is important to say clearly, this is not a simple story of good and evil, however each side may sometimes tell it. It is a tragedy in the truest sense, a collision not of right against wrong, but of 2 profound and genuine claims that have proven so far impossible to reconcile. Understanding Jerusalem means holding that difficulty honestly and resisting the temptation to flatten it into a slogan for one side or the other. When the modern state of Israel was established in 1948, war followed between the new state and its Arab neighbors. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were displaced from their homes in what they call the Nakba, the catastrophe, a wound at the center of Palestinian identity to this day. Jerusalem itself was left divided by the fighting, the western part under Israeli control, and the eastern part, including the walled old city with all its holy places, under the control of Jordan. For 19 years, a wall and a strip of no man's land ran through the middle of the city, past shuttered windows and barbed wire, and Jews were unable to reach the western wall, cut off from the holiest place they could pray. Then, in the Six-Day War of 1967, Israel captured East Jerusalem and the Old City, and Israeli soldiers reached the Western Wall for the first time. In a generation, many of them weeping, an image of overwhelming emotion for Jews around the world, the return to a place longed for across 2,000 years. Israel subsequently declared the whole of Jerusalem its united and eternal capital. But most of the international community never recognized that annexation of East Jerusalem, regarding it as occupied territory under international law. And the Palestinians looked to East Jerusalem, including the Old City, as the capital of a future Palestinian state, the heart of the nation they seek. So the status of Jerusalem, who it belongs to, who governs it, whose capital it is, who controls its holy places, remains one of the most bitterly disputed questions on earth, one of the great unsolved knots at the very heart of the entire Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Every attempt at a peace agreement has foundered, again and again, in large part on this single city. Both peoples claim it as their capital. Both have deep, genuine, ancient ties to it. Neither can imagine giving it up. And that is precisely why it is so hard. Nowhere is this more delicate or more dangerous than on the sacred platform itself, the Temple Mount to Jews, the Haram al-Sharif to Muslims, same few hundred square meters where the whole story began. After 1967, a fragile arrangement was put in place, often called the status quo, intended to keep an uneasy peace on the holy esplanade. Under it, the Muslim religious authority continued to administer the sacred platform and its mosques, while Israel controlled security and access. For many years, a key part of that arrangement was that Muslims could pray on the platform, while Jews, though permitted to visit, would pray below at the Western Wall and not on the mount itself, in part out of respect for its sensitivity, and in part because many rabbinical authorities forbid Jews from treading on ground so holy that the location of the ancient Holy of Holies is uncertain. For decades, the delicate balance largely held, but it has come under increasing strain. In recent years, tensions on and around the holy site have risen sharply. There have been repeated confrontations and clashes on the esplanade. Growing numbers of Jewish visitors, some of them nationalists who wish to see Jewish prayer, or one day even a rebuilt temple on the Mount, have visited in ways that many Palestinians and Muslims around the world view with deep alarm as a threat to the status quo and to the Islamic character of the sanctuary. Israeli officials have generally insisted the status quo remains in place, even as, on the ground, small groups of Jews have increasingly prayed on the platform in ways not seen for centuries. Restrictions on Muslim access, especially during periods of tension, have caused their own anger and pain. Every rumor of a change to the arrangement, every provocative visit, every clash at the site can send shockwaves, not just through the city, but across the entire Muslim and Jewish worlds. sometimes igniting wider violence. There may be no more sensitive, few hundred square meters, anywhere on the planet, and beyond the holy sites, the daily reality of the divided city is one of deep and painful inequality and friction. In the tangled neighborhoods of East Jerusalem, Palestinian residents and Israeli authorities and settler organizations contest homes and land, sometimes house by house. There have been evictions, demolitions, and displacements that cause enormous hardship and anger. Heavy security, surveillance, and periodic violence are woven into the fabric of daily life. As this film is made, the wider region has been consumed by a devastating and bloody conflict, and Jerusalem sits at the raw nerve center of it all, the symbolic prize, the emotional heart, the wound that will not close. It would be dishonest to pretend to you that any of this is settled, or that there is an easy answer. There is not. There are two peoples who both love this land and this city with everything they have, and that, in the cruelest of ironies, is exactly the problem. Step outside the walls, and even the natural setting of Jerusalem seems to carry the weight of all this meaning. Just east of the old city, across a deep valley, rises the Mount of Olives, a hillside that has been a sacred cemetery for 3,000 years, its slopes covered with an astonishing sea of white Jewish graves, tens of thousands of them, because to be buried here, facing the Temple Mount, is to be first in line, according to tradition, when the dead are one day raised. From the top of the Mount of Olives, you get the classic view of Jerusalem, the golden dome of the rock, the grey domes of the churches, the honey-colored walls, all glowing at sunset in the famous light of Jerusalem stone, the pale local limestone from which the whole city is built by law, so that every building, ancient and modern, shares the same golden glow, and the land itself is a place of stark biblical drama. Jerusalem sits on the very edge of a wilderness. Walk a short distance east, and the green hills fall away abruptly into the Judean desert, a harsh and beautiful land of bare rock and canyon that plunges down toward the lowest point on the surface of the earth, the Dead Sea, its mineral-heavy waters so salty that nothing lives in them and no swimmer can sink. This is a landscape that has shaped the religious imagination for thousands of years. The holy city on its ridge, and just beside it, the desert of prophets and hermits and temptations, the wilderness where, in all three traditions, human beings have gone to be alone with God. Even the wildlife here carries an ancient resonance. On the cliffs of the surrounding hills and deserts nest the birds that have always haunted this landscape, including, soaring high over the Judean wilderness, the great vultures and eagles of the region. And in the rocky ground live the small, shy creatures of the hills, like the rock hyrax, a rotund little animal that basks on the warm stones mentioned in the ancient scriptures of this land. Twice a year, too, Jerusalem lies beneath one of the great flyways of the world, and the skies over the holy city fill with millions of migrating birds, storks and raptors and songbirds pouring between Europe, Asia, and Africa along the great rift that runs through this land. Crossing over the contested city far below, following a map older than any temple, indifferent to every border and every claim. Something about that is fitting. That above the most fought-over city on earth, the birds still cross freely, twice a year, belonging to no one. So come back at the end, to that hill where we began, and stand on the Mount of Olives as the sun goes down over Jerusalem. The light turns the whole city to gold, the ancient walls, the domes, the towers, all glowing in the soft radiance that has made poets and pilgrims weep for 3,000 years. The golden dome of the rock catches the last of the sun on the sacred platform. Below it, at the western wall, people are gathering to pray as the Sabbath or the evening comes, pressing their written prayers into the ancient stones. In the church of the Holy Sepulchre, candles are being lit in the dim, incense-heavy air over the empty tomb. From the minarets, the call to prayer begins to roll out across the rooftops. The church bells answer it, and somewhere the low sound of Hebrew prayer rises from the wall. Three faiths, calling out to the same heaven, over the same few hundred meters of stone, at the same moment they have for more than 1,000 years. None of it is decided. The great conflict at the city's heart may find, someday, some peace that has eluded every generation so far, some way for two peoples to share the one city they both cannot live without. Or it may not, and the sorrow may continue, as it has for so long. The status of the holy sites, the fate of the neighborhoods, the question of whose city this truly is, all of it remains open, painful, unresolved, waiting on a future no one can see. Anyone who tells you they know how it ends is not being honest. But this, too, is true, and it is perhaps the deepest thing this ancient city has to teach. Jerusalem is proof of something almost unbearable about human beings. That the very same thing, a holy place, a sacred stone, a longing for God, can be at once the source of our most beautiful devotion and our most terrible division. That we are capable of loving a place so much that we will pray toward it for 3,000 years across the whole world, carry it in our hearts through exile and persecution, weep at the mere sight of its golden light, and also capable of shedding endless blood over it, precisely because we love it too much to share. Holiness and the heartbreak are not two different stories. They are the same story. That is the mystery of Jerusalem. That is why it has stood, for so many, for so long, as the center of the world. The city has survived more than 40 conquests. It has been destroyed and rebuilt on the same stones again and again. It has been wept for, prayed toward, longed for, fought over by a larger share of the human race, for longer than any other place on earth. And still, it stands on its ancient ridge, above its ancient spring, glowing gold at sunset, holding heaven and earth, hope and sorrow, together in the same handful of sacred stone. Take a breath. Stay a while. The sun will set on the golden city, and the prayers will rise from it, whether the world ever finds its peace or not. This has been Where on Earth. Thank you for watching, and until the next journey.